All right. Well, good morning, Greg, and to
Morning, Brian.
Brian Willis. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thank you. Yeah. So for those listening, we've been on all the links are in the episode details about Brian. I know I gave a little quick intro about him, but you can go check out his stuff. He's always putting out great content. We've gone on your show a couple times to discuss a bunch of different topics, and it's always revolved specifically around training. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about today. So for everyone listening, we get, please, if those of you reaching out with questions and comments about stuff, keep them coming, because this is what we get to do right now today is we get to talk about it. And for this specific discussion, we wanted to bring on Brian Willis from his experience training law enforcement officers and just bringing his perspective to this to directly kind of talk about some questions that one of our listeners reached out to us with. So I'll go ahead, guys, and I'll start by reading the email, and then kind of we'll jump into it from there if that works for you guys.
Yep, perfect.
All right. So first of all, the listener reached out and said, my question is focused around training. And this individual has reached out to us before. He was involved. He's a law enforcement officer out on the West Coast, was involved in somewhat of a high profile kind of active shooter incident. And, we've been in contact since, but he was talking about that incident with some of his folks during a training event. And one of the sergeants, is a SWAT guy, said for years, loves to talk about tactics. He asked the group after the initial contact team goes into the scene to make contact, how many more should go in, right? He's talking about this active shooter situation. He said, is it more important to send more people in to solve the problem, or should a command post be set up next? So he's doing like a thought experiment, right? A tactical decision game. And so you said one person answered that, hey, stick to the SOP. If one guy goes in, the next guy starts the command post. And what our listener, the guy who wrote in, said, well, it depends. And he said he gave his reason that the size of the scene, the complexity of it, the number of shooters all dictate what the response is going to be. He said he tried to get them to understand that SOPs don't necessarily mean anything in those situations because people lose their minds. He said from the point of view that most people are running about 30% of their mental capacity due to the high stress and frenetic nature of active shooters. What he suggested, if we're going to do any changes to the way we train active shooter scenarios, is to focus less on the kinetic of the find the bad guy, kill the bad guy, then stop the dying, and more on the what now question. And teach officers how to, it's going to be difficult to focus, and you're going to have different types of physiological and psychological stressors. And so basically what he came down to is about talking about training complexity of scenarios outside of just running hallways and engaging with guns. And what he said, that a lot of people, look at these videos and conduct training on it. And now he's showing up these places like, hey, I was the one in that scenario, right? And what his response was, he said the biggest failure and possibly the most important was the lack of coordination and leadership outside of the building. So outside of this active shooter incident. And he said it was a goat rodeo and quite frankly, embarrassing. So his questions had to do with, what flaws, if any, in his reasoning and suggestions. What would you have to suggest to focus on for training and active shooter topics? What am I missing? So um, a lot of this comes, there's a whole bunch of issues in here that we're going to dissect right now, I think. But it comes down to when people are trying to do, some sort of cognitive or cognition based training scenario, right? We're all good at, we can run reps in a house and practice our reloads and shoot all those rounds on a range. And that's really good. And it's all completely necessary. But we haven't really focused on is when we're building these training scenarios, right? How do you build train for making better decisions? Because that's really what it's about. You can have your SOPs and your TTPs. You can have even if you have a good understanding of the situation at hand, what do we do right now? What's next? And kind of my thing is to focus on if you're going to do some sort of cognition based training, you have to do it correctly and you have to set up the events correctly. And to me, that's more important than just running the reps in the house. It's, why are we doing this? We need to make the best decision we can right now, just right now. I mean, because that's going to change over time. We're never going to have all the information. So how do you train for that event? And a lot of this stuff is kind of not based on, but I know heavily influenced by different like military tactics, especially when you get into this active shooter stuff and close quarters combat training or CQB or room entry tactics, whatever anyone's calling it. And the problem with that is those stuff usually comes from like, tier one military units where that's the only thing they do. That is their one job that they do. And they have the time and the resources to constantly train to the point where they can't do it wrong. Well, that's not what we're talking about here with policing and a police response to these situations. So there's a lot we're going to jump into, and I want to throw it at first to you, Greg, to kind of he gave the answer, it depends, which we like, but we talk about cognitive load and cognitive training. Where do we start with this so that we can kind of map out this conversation and hopefully answer the questions?
So I'm going to be the fart in the elevator, Brian. I'm going to start off by throwing in a grenade because there's so many topics here, and your source for information asked a bunch of great questions. So first of all, let me speak directly to the it depends. So we just came off of working on a project for Black Moon LLC, who we love and respect and admire. Before that, it was a DARPA project, and the words that the scientists say are different than the words that the person funding the experiment want to hear. So they come in and they want a concrete answer on this multifaceted question. And we have to tell them it depends. It's situationally dependent, and there's a bunch of factors to be considered. They get pissed and they go out and they start another study. Okay. So first of all, we got to stop saying that it depends is a bad thing, because it depends is the answer in many parts of the question. Second part is that we have to look at our dictionary and figure out what cognition means, because most of the people that are talking and saying that they're creating cognitively complex scenarios have no idea what either of those words mean, what a scenario is supposed to mean, and what cognition is. Do we want to manage uncertainty? Do we want to create a best practices for entry? I go to what Shelley, our CEO, says all the time when we're working on a complex issue. She'll poke her head into the room and she'll yell out, bump, set, spike. Where are we in the volleyball of the bump, the set, the spike? What part of this problem are we trying to solve? So I'll throw this to you, Brian. I'll say that if you're not doing a cognitive task analysis and you've got a place called the cognitive division, and they're not asking the questions that we and Brian Willis and you were about to delve into, then take the cognitive division nameplate off the door. And second part is we have to stop training for the last event. All of our training spirals towards the last event. We want to change or mod our tactics based on this shit show that we were just involved with. Rather, we have to start training for best practices, find out what those are, vet those, and then continue. You said thought experiment. That's what life is. Life is a thought experiment.
Right.
And we've relegated cognition to memory, to improving our memory. Now, it's all about focus. And there's only a certain amount of things in a deadly encounter that you can focus on and attend to. And if the training doesn't go there, then you're never going to improve in training. Listen, there is no such thing as muscle memory. You can only tap, rack, and bang so many times. You can only shoot. We met some shooters this past week, Brian, are the best shooters in the face of the planet, and they can do the tires, and they can, roll the tires and do the ropes and everything else. Is that going to help them think their way out of a complex situation? That's my question. Now I want to shut up and let the real expert on the show talk. Brian Willis, I'm a huge fan of yours, Brian, have been for a long time, and you're winning mind training. I love your content. Over.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate that. And I think you're right on the money. I think the key here is what we need to do is we need to embrace the power of questions. There's a quote from Bertrand Russell, a Nobel laureate, that says it is a healthy thing every now and then to hang a question mark on things that we have long taken for granted. And I don't think we're very good at that. I don't think we're good at hanging a question mark on things that we've taken for granted. And we just keep focusing on a lot of the same things. We focus on the technical, tactical, and physical, which are all important, but we don't pay enough attention to the mental side, to the thinking part of it. And I think we make that more complicated than it needs to be. And I think what we need to understand is that critical thinking is a skill, decision-making is a skill, problem solving is a skill. These are all trainable skills, but they're skills that we need to start teaching at the academy, because there's still too many academies that are built around shut your mouth and do what you're told. and train people for compliance and not for critical thinking. And then it needs to be reinforced in the FTO phase and then reinforced throughout people's careers. So, I think that what we tend to do is we want a checklist. I completely agree with you with the depends. I think that what I tell people is to remember adult diapers. Adult diapers are called depends, and depends is the answer to almost all these questions because there's so many different factors. And the other piece around, best practices is Mark Sanborn, a leadership trainer, cautions people about best practices because he says there's always three qualifiers: best practices for now, best practices that we know of, and best practices given the situation.
Yep.
And so what he advocates for is better practice. How can we do what everybody else is doing, but do it better? And then next practice is how can we change the game? And I think that's where we sometimes get caught up. We're not thinking about these things from, an ongoing basis. So we can teach 4 officer contact teams, but in the vast majority of police departments around North America, there's not going to be 4 officers at the scene of an active killer event within the first 10 minutes. So do we teach them how to solve the problem with 1, with 2, with 3, with 4? And I agree exactly with, what you said and what the person who wrote in said is there's so many factors. Is this a 2,000 square foot single room place where the active killer is? And I'll use the term active killer. I'm not a fan of the term active shooter because not all active killers have a firearm. And sometimes they transition from a firearm to an edge weapon. So we get locked in sometimes to thinking about that needs to be a gun. And so I think we just need to teach people to think and to make decisions and problem solve. And I think that that's, instead of it being a training day or the training block, that's something that you guys talked about in your the last podcast I listened to, but challenging our assumptions about we need to do this every day at roll call. 10 minutes a day, 4 days a week, 48 weeks out of the year is 32 hours of training a year. If we do it 5 days a week, it's 40 hours of training a year. That's an opportunity to train decision-making, critical thinking, problem solving, so that when we get into these situations, we know how to use the gift of time and distance, as you talk about, and we will ask better questions and we will slow things down so that we can think. So I think we need to focus on embracing more the power of questions instead of just always wanting answers, and teach decision making.
Brian,
So
can I
that's
copy
well,
it?
yeah. That's and
Yep.
that leads into, I know some of the stuff you brought up. That's exactly kind of what we
Spot on.
would call it. Like you said, challenging your assumptions. Why is it that we're doing this way? But and that this goes into everything we've been talking about. Is one of the questions we always get is, well, how do I do that with what I'm doing right now? How would I actually do that? How would I increase someone's ability to problem solve and make decisions? And my always suggestion is, whatever you're doing right now, you have to literally have someone standing next to the individual going, okay, well, why are you doing that? Now, does this slow things down and cause you to like, hey, but we got to get in there to the house and this is going on? No, we'll get in there. Don't worry. Like that's going to keep going on. And I think it does a couple things. Is one, like you just addressed, it brings in that reasoning behind my decisions. Now I have to think about why I'm doing it rather than just doing it because this is how I was trained to do it. So now I'm thinking, and it's training. It's what you're building in that individual is to how to use the gift of time and distance to not run into the place. Yeah, no, we get it. There's loud noises going off. There's shooting. There's people with guns. But hey, you got a gun, and your buddies over here, they got guns. So like, just let's take a breath. Why are we doing this? And because we often have more time in these situations than we think. I mean, the ability when we say slow time down is, you can't don't walk slower, right? Or something, just speak slower, but it's how do I focus on what I need to focus on? Because now I'm increasing my ability to problem solve and I'm getting faster at cognition, which means technically I am slowing time down because I'm processing things faster, but also taking that breath. I mean, there's plenty of times when everyone wished they had an extra second to inform themselves of making the right decision. And because like you said, the training is so focused on, given this set of circumstances, this is what you will do. Now go do it. Well, that's kind of setting up that person up for failure. Does that make sense, Greg?
Yeah. And here's the thing. let's endeavor to understand that the podcast that we're recording right now is going to be for black belt trainers, but anybody can listen to it. If you're in HR, if you're at home, listen to what we're trying to tell you. One, if you're not doing a cognitive task analysis, in other words, if you're not taking a look at the skills you're trying to imbue upon your audience and focusing on those skills.
No,
right?
Greg, can you please kind of like define that a little bit further? What
Yeah,
you
yeah.
mean by cognitive task analysis?
And can I do it with the story, Brian?
Yeah,
Would you give me
please.
just 2 minutes.
You usually
Okay,
do. So yeah.
So our best friend in the world outside of the United States right now is Martin Woolley. Martin Woolley's on our board of directors. He's been a dear friend. He's been through heinous combat situations and incredible training situations, and his work with NATO and all the other allies. So Martin is a subject matter expert. His bona fides precede him. So I sent him a couple of slides because he's briefing a client of ours in Saudi Arabia, and I sent him just photos and then a narrative on a separate sheet of paper and said, this is what I would say at these photos. Why? Because he's a subject matter expert. All he needs to know is, here's what I'm trying to convey. So you put it into your own words, and here's the pictures that I would use. So what does Martin do? Martin forgets his cognitive task analysis. Okay, if you're working with a person's working memory, what they're thinking of right now, if you have two visual items up at the same time, their brain is going to compete for it. Then if you put words on the slide, the brain is competing even more, and they're not going to be making a connection like you think they are. Now, it might be the best looking slide that you've ever built for presentation, but the person's cognition isn't occurring in the manner that you think. And so money's left on the table during the negotiation. So explanatory information has almost zero impact on your working memory, which means when you narrate a story, people are tuning in and going, and then, and they're eating the popcorn and they're listening.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to get Martin to understand is, do me a favor, just show these 3 slides. Martin comes back an hour later. He's got 11 slides. He's got pictures and news articles and words and arrows. And what he did is he did what Brian and I call the Boyd's OODA loop. Have you ever seen somebody try to explain Boyd's OODA loop? It's a very simple process, but what do? They've got diagrams and moving parts, and then they click on the next one and more words come in. Brian, a cognitive task analysis is if I was going to teach my kid how to ride the bike after the training wheels. What are the 3 or 4 things that I would impart on them as I'm running alongside of them as a mentor and yelling suggestions in their ear before they get the tacit and experiential knowledge of actually wiggling around and fighting gravity and learning all about physics and motion. So you can lead the horse to water, and you can kneel down next to him and you can drink, but sooner or later you have to break those tasks down into, now lead horse to water, now allow water to flow, now do, and guess what? People aren't doing that. You remember our dear friend Jonesy from the shoot house long ago, that was the infantry immersive trainer before it did a cognitive task analysis. What was his book? When you open a book, it was Contact Front, React to Sniper. That's not a cognitive task analysis. What I'm saying is that you have to break the situation down and say, here's the critical things that I'm trying to impart from this training. And these are directly correlative to the task the person is going to do on the street once they leave this training. And here's the component that they'll have to build on their own by sense making and problem solving. Brian, if we don't do that, then all we're doing is a binary shoot, don't shoot. And what are we going to learn? You know, in this situation at this time, it's okay to pull your gun. Oh, wait, it's not a gun, it's a camera. That's horse crap training. And I resent it. That I hope I answered that.
Yeah, and I'll go to you, Brian Willis. Kind of any thoughts on that too?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think there's 2 elements to this, is that we tend to think of training as solely the responsibility of whoever wears the formal training shirt.
That's a good point.
The training cadre. What I think we need to do is expand the tribe of trainers. Training should be an agency-wide initiative and an agency-wide responsibility. You have tremendous amount of experience and expertise in all areas of your organization, and we fail to tap into that. We fail to train our frontline supervisors. A lot of times we fail to teach them how to lead, but we also fail to teach them how to teach or how to train. how to
So
conduct
true.
that 10 minutes at roll call, how to take a video that might be 90 seconds long and break it down and take 2 weeks to cover that video, because we're stopping it every 8 to 10 seconds at the decision point and talking about what could you do here as opposed to what would you do. So what would you do implies there's a single right answer. What could you do implies there's multiple potential ways to fix this. So it opens it up to that brainstorming and forces people to think. And then we do that for 10 minutes and we kick them loose. We haven't closed the loop on that. So for the rest of their shift, they're talking about it, they're thinking about it, they're reflecting on it, they're looking up policy, they're looking up legal issues, and we're getting 2 additional hours of learning out of that 10 minutes of thinking. And then we do the same the next day and the next day and the next day. And we constantly do this. I think we try to make it when we put it all in the responsibility of solely the training unit, then we get that once a year blocked and siloed in-service training. When we expand the tribe of trainers, now every day is a training day, and it's pervasive throughout the organization. And then we start to figure out how to think and how to solve problems. But I think that again, it needs to go back to the academy. It needs to be reinforced with our FTOs. We need to put the T, the trainer, in the FTO as opposed to the tick box, and then expand the tribe of trainers so that we can do some of these things.
You brought up a really good point, and you said, let's make, every day is a training day. Well, every day is a training day, whether or not you realize it. And I look at that even with what I do here at home with my family. So new place, moved in not long ago. Bigger place, home, a lot of upkeep, different stuff we have to do. So rather than going through every single thing on the property and explaining to my wife and daughter how everything works, it's one thing at a time. So like this week is lights. We're focusing on lights. Which lights go on when and which ones go off and when they go off, to train the little one to turn the lights off when you leave the room. But at night, the exterior lights go on, right? So, but that's it. So everyone gets to call each other out this week on lights, where she likes to, oh, you left a light on in there, or and what we're doing is training. I'm training my wife, I'm training my daughter, I'm training myself, because I'm a human being too. And, I'm going to miss stuff, but it's building in that redundancy of, outside we turn lights on at night because we keep some bad people away sometimes, right? And inside the lights go off, and she understands that, oh, that's how, if I want to see outside, the lights go on outside and the lights stay off inside, because that's how the light works. But it's those little things. That's all we're doing this week. That's it this week. But it's interesting that one of the things when we develop these SOPs and TTPs, we don't always know how it's going to work out until the event actually happens, right? Look at Russia in Ukraine right now. But I'll give a better example is that we same thing this morning at the house. I forget to turn the alarm off when I got up this morning. So I always get up earlier before everyone. I take the dog out, do all that. So what happens when I open up the door? The alarm goes off. So I'm doing oh crap, I'm like still half asleep trying to shut this thing off. And the little one, the insurgent, she comes running out towards the side door where I was at. And I was like, hey, that wasn't the SOP we practiced, right? The alarm goes off. She's supposed to go to a certain place and do this, right? So that wasn't it. So I had to do a debrief this morning. I was like, hey, sweetie, well, sorry about that. My bad. We explained that. She calmed down. She stopped crying because she got woken up from that. And I go, well, how come you ran over there? And she said, well, I saw that it was like already 5 o'clock in the morning and either you or mommy are up by then. And I thought mommy was maybe going out to the garage to ride her bike or something like that. I was like, oh, okay. Well, what are we supposed to do? And it was like, oh, I forgot. Yeah. So I was like, okay, little SOP rehearsal, right? So that's something I do personally in my life. Well, that's training. Everything is training. Every day you're alive is a training day. You're teaching people are teaching you what's important. So if we focus on those small things each day, that's what makes it better. And that what if game has to be sort of cognitively real, right? It has to be this, well, what's likely going to occur? And there's different thought experiments that people can use. But I think it, like you said earlier, we overcomplicate this stuff. Like we really overcomplicate it. Most people know their jobs, and in a calm stress-free environment, I can ask someone what the SOPs are, what the TTPs are, what they're supposed to do, and they're likely going to get it correct. Like, oh, well, we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to do that. But then when you put them in that situation, it's like we data dump that goes out the window, and we go, oh my God, this is it. This is what we've trained for. Holy crap. And that's when, that stress starts to happen. There's physiological and psychological arousal that can overwhelm people. So it's like we have all these sound tactics, techniques, and procedures that work, yet we're not even applying them in a real incident because maybe we didn't test them properly in the training scenario. Does that kind of make sense?
So Brian, you're right back to the bump set spike, and what you did is fantastic. You're at the academy with the insurgent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're there as is a mentor and a guide that's making minor adjustments as the situation progresses, so you don't have to have major involvement when that person's out on the road. So what's a basic rule of the academy? Basic rule of the academy is I have to be able to read the situation and make the right choice. I'm going to skin my knees a couple of times. Somebody's going to lift me up and move me down the road a little bit. Second part is, what's my role of FTO learning on the street? I have to be able to read my partner in an environment to avoid a catastrophic incident. And then what's the role as me as now that on-duty, on-road supervisor? Well, it's to manage expectations clearly so that I read the community and what the community needs tonight, and I can cut down that foot chase, or I can stop that vehicle pursuit because it becomes too risky. We don't think like that, do we? We think like we achieved this, and this is a check, just exactly the tick in the box that Brian Willis is talking about. So I would say this. One, I will give you a thought experiment, both of you, that I used for the Marines that were going into very kinetic Iraq back in the day. If you remember, Brian Marin, I would ask them to count the feral cats overnight when they went out on their patrols. And the idea was, if I can get you paying attention to cats that are unattended in your environment, I can get you to pay attention to anything, because attention is more important than memory. And the idea is that we taught people to focus their energy on information that's important to their survival, finding bombs, finding snipers, finding insider threats. And we have to understand that attention is limited. And it's limited in terms of both capacity and duration. So attention is the ability to actively process specific information in your environment and tune out other details that don't matter for your survival. So to manage your attentional resources and make sense of the world around you, it's not just centering your focus on a particular topic at on-duty or off-duty roll call. It's ignoring a great deal of competing information and stimuli while you're out on the road, so you can tune in and then tune out those sensations, information, perceptions that aren't relevant at that motion. But what do? The FTO, I have to tell you, I have to show you, then you have to show me. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So the bumps that spike overall goal I get, but what I'm saying is there's too much of reliance on now step A, then we'll do step B, and then it's step C. So I don't want to say it's just outcomes-based learning, but the cognitive portion should be, we should zero in on what you attend to and whether you're attending to the right things in your environment that will assist you in the sense make. And problem solve, I'll say this is wrong with what your reader wrote in. Problem solve isn't shooting the active killer or stopping the active killer threats. Problem solve is also thinking about it in the context of what's to come next, after bang, and left of the next bang. Brian, do you get what I'm trying to say? And that's a function of training. So I believe in the holistic training approach, but I think if it's going to be ongoing, that it has to be played forward as well. What could happen and what should we be doing now to prepare for it?
And just to build on that, because I agree 100%, Greg, is I think what happens a lot of times in our debriefs is they're all about telling. They're the supervisor telling, the FTO telling, the trainer telling. And Brian, one of the things out of your story with your daughter is what you did is you asked questions. And so what we need to do, I think, is to train people to ask more and tell less, so that we start to understand what was their thought process. And then to build on what Greg just said, is those debriefs need to be built around feed forward, not feedback.
There you go.
Because we're just talking about what happened. That's what your listener sent in about what should we have done. Well, it's too late. We can't go back and change that. But we spent a lot of time in debriefs on feedback. This is what you should have done, as opposed to feed forward. When you find yourself in a similar situation in the future, what could you do differently to enhance the outcome, so that that we're now thinking into the future, and we're asking questions to get them to think through it, them to come up with the answers. We can fine tune some of that or redirect some of that. Then we can have them, in order for them to answer those questions, as you know, they have to be imagining that. So they have to be imagining those more desirable outcomes. So now they're creating some of those new files already, and they're starting to problem solve for the future instead of problem solve for the past. Because I think we spend too much time problem solving for the past, and we can't go back there, as opposed to feed forward and what can we do better or in a more desirable way in the future. And again, you know, as you say, attention being limited, a lot of times I'm giving you feedback on what I think you should have paid attention to based on you know, hindsight bias, because I know now all the information afterwards. And so we don't teach people. We say you need to pay attention, but we don't teach people how to pay attention or what to pay attention to. So I think we need to reframe some of those things from a training perspective so that the training changes behavior. Because if it's just me telling, you know what it's like. If I'm just yapping at you, telling you something, there's a whole bunch of white noise going on in your head. You're probably not listening to anything. You haven't actually learned anything. And so there's no change in behavior in the future. So, you know, as you guys always talk about, training changes behavior, but if we want to change behavior, then we need to shift the way that we address some of these issues, such as debriefings.
No, and that's that also gets into kind of, you know, what the plan is and standard operating procedures and how we're supposed to do things, because, you know, one, there's two ways to look at it, and I don't want it to be confusing because they almost seem dichotomous. Is one, I'm the first person to tell you, plan the dive the plan. All right, like, there, do not change that plan unless there is a necessary reason to, because, and that's usually because, one, there's other people relying on that plan. So if you go sideways on that and they're still on that plan, like, the whole thing's going to go to crap. But, you know, understand that standard operating procedures, tactics, technique procedures, they're a guideline. I mean, they are a framework to use that sometimes they might not work, and that's where you get into, well, initiative based tactics and what am I supposed to do. And I think a lot of times in training, you know, we don't set up scenarios to where your SOP is going to fail you, right? It's just, I follow this SOP and then we go, see, you did it wrong, you didn't do it here. Oh, okay, yeah, I see that. But you have to test it where it's going to fail and put that person in that situation to make a decision based on just how they're evaluating that situation. And one of the things that, you know, it's kind of like a segue into the next thing that I do want to talk about that a lot of people do. And he brought up how these events, active killer events, which I like your term for it, is you know, they get chaotic, people get overwhelmed, and we start to make poor decisions. Everyone understands the psychological and physiological response and how it diminishes our, not just our problem solving and thinking ability, but our ability to communicate and operate effectively and efficiently. All that stuff starts to break down. And what a lot of people try to do is what you would call some sort of stress inoculation training. Okay, I'm going to get you in here, I'm going to stress you out, I'm going to get you used to that. And I don't know if it's not that that's bad. It's a good thing to do that, but I don't know if it's usually done properly, and I don't know if it's described properly even. So I'll give you the example of you know, let's say you're on some sort of entry team and you use flashbangs. Okay, well, you need to be exposed to a flash. You need to feel and eat a flashbang yourself if you're going to use it, so you know. And the first time it's like, holy crap, like that's intense. Wow, it's really bright, and yeah, that sucked the air out of my mouth, and damn, my head's ringing, all that stuff. Okay, that's pretty crazy. But after 37 times, you're just like, oh, did we throw the bang yet? You know what I mean? Did that go off? You know, and that's not really stress inoculation. That's basically, it's sensory adaptation, right? Meaning, the more I expose you to a stimulus, the less likely you are to notice it. That's when you move to a place and there's all kinds of busy traffic on the street where you came from a quiet place. At first, it's annoying. It keeps you up all night. After a while, you're not going to notice it. Well, that happens to a lot of the training that we do. So it's not really inoculating you into stress, or you know, it's really just kind of getting you used to the booms and bangs, which you need to be, right? But that's not a bad thing. But I often think it's described incorrectly and done incorrectly. I'm just gonna, a lot of times what I've seen is we're gonna throw you into this chaotic situation and it's gonna be overwhelming and you can't win, or it's so ridiculous that like it's just meant to stress you out and force you to do something wrong. And I I don't think that has the effect, the intended effect that person wants. I think it can often be detrimental, because when you're in training, you got to remember two things: dopamine and cortisol, right? I can play with those electrochemical neurotransmitters. I want to get you some dopamine. I want to get you excited and happy that, ooh, I did it right. Look at that. I learned something new, because boom, that information is going to be sticky. And then the cortisol response, I want that, ooh, man, I kind of did that wrong. I don't want to do it like that. Right. But I still need to have a win in that training. I still need to I need to be shown that there's a way for me to win every situation, because if I don't, I'm going to get into something that's cognitively close enough to that training scenario you set up where everyone died and I died. And then that's what's going to happen in real life. Does that kind of make sense, Greg? I don't like.
Yeah, but I want to defer to Brian Willis on
Okay.
this one. Brian, I'd like to ride your coattails on this one and throw it to you, because I've got a very definitive way of talking about stress inoculation. But please, let me cede the floor to you as our guest.
Well, my take on this is that the problem that I see is exactly what Brian described, is that all we've locked into is the word stress out of stress inoculation. And we think that stress is a key to training. So we just overwhelm people with artificial stressors. The way I talk about it is I don't think that stress is a key to effective training. I think context is king. I think what we need to do is put people in contextual environments that may create stress for them. And give them some skills, put them in a contextual environment, let them have some measure of success. Now, there's going to be some struggle. I think we need to embrace that desirable difficulties that Robert Bjork, the professor at UCLA, talks about, that there needs to be some struggle and some friction for learning to take place. And we're going to let them struggle a little bit, but they're going to work their way through it and fix it. And then we're going to continue to add some of these contextual environments and build that until they can be in a situation where, so Brian, this is very similar to, when you did that infantry immersive trainer program, where your philosophy is your first day in combat is going to be no worse than your last day in training. But you didn't start with that event. It was a building block process. That's, I think, what we miss. What you see in some academies is they take this stress inoculation model, this building block model, and they flip it on its head, and they overwhelm the crap out of people at the start of the academy and then taper off as they go on. And so they're not setting people up for success, to learn how to problem solve in an incremental manner. And so, we switched some of that with our training. We went away from the language of right and wrong. We talked about more desirable and less desirable. So you know what? It's less desirable to get shot, stabbed, punched, kicked, sprayed. But if that happens, you better do something that's more desirable to fix the problem, or it's going to continue to happen. Because what we saw is that people thought they did something wrong, they just shut down. So what they would continually hear from us in training is just fix it, just make it work. What do you need to do, and get them to work through this. So I think that we need to take a step back. Stress inoculation, as you know, is a viable concept, but we've just locked on to the word stress. And I've been to places where they're super proud of the fact that they run stress academies, and they just stress the crap out of people right from the start and overwhelm them. And then they create all kinds of problems for their people and don't set their people up for success. So I think we need to take a step back. I think if we focus on the context, then the stress element will look after itself. If the context is realistic and it's incremental in nature, then the stress piece is going to look after itself. But I think stress is subjective. So I could create a scenario and put the two of you through it, and you might be completely unfazed, and somebody else is going to be completely overwhelmed because you have a whole different world of experience and training and knowledge. So, I think we need to think differently about stress. So that would be my take. So Greg, over to you.
No, I love that, Brian. And I would go, before we jumped into this, Brian, you started talking about TTPs, and I'm going to call you Alvin Ailey on this one, because I agree with you. What we're not trying to do is create interpretive dance at on-duty and off-duty roll call,
Right.
and everybody gets a chance to dance
Yeah.
their own dance. That's
Yeah.
not what this is about. If you're in the moment, follow your TTPs, because all those lessons were written in blood and you'll probably be fine. What we're talking about is an entirely different thing. We're talking about stress. And you know what? A little piece of dirt and friction creates a pearl. That's how that process works. And that's what we want to do. But Rasputin said, hey, listen, every morning I'm going to take a little bit of poison. So if somebody tries to poison me, I'll be inoculated. That doesn't work so well. Okay. So what we need to understand is that what we're trying to mess with is the human cognitive load. If we are going to have a cognitive division, let's cut the bullshit and actually have a cognitive division. What does that mean? De-escalation is a function of the mind when the mind is given multiple tasks and the multiple tasks compete for each other. So we have to understand that the less I'm able to compete, which multitasking doesn't work, the less I'm able to compete in this environment, the more likely I'm going to escalate my level of violence to get my thing done. Okay. So if I have fewer options, the option that we never talk about is force. And we're going to increase that hidden hidden object that's there in the file folders always. It's the paper that all of our scenarios are written on, because I'm scared. So if we're talking about stress inoculation, is show us what it's like to see, smell, and feel rage, to feel fear, that it's okay, and that you can countermand fear with training, then I'm all for that. But what happens, Brian, is that we have to understand that cognition is acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. So what you're talking about is cognition, not stress inoculation. And I completely agree with Brian Willis. It's dependent and subjective. So instead of trying to set out to create an environment, like, for example, two different parts of your brain deal with that flashbang. Your prefrontal cortex, your prefrontal cortex goes, I know the nomenclature. I know what this does. I know the blast radius. I know all these other things. Then your prelimbic brain goes bang loud. You see what I'm trying to say? And then primitive brain associates it with shit. I might die in this situation. If we don't play that in training, and that's what I'm talking about, that cognitive task analysis. What do I want to impart? How do I want to impart it? And what's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to think through the problem. So you're not going to get there without addressing those psychologically, physiologically, and sociologically for each event. So is some training bad? Because I heard somebody say, well, all training is good. No, that's not true at all. And if you're going to train the brain, I say take a little longer and train the corticals of the brain that are going to address these situations most readily. This is a problem-solving task, and we're going to increase the level of complexity like a rheostat and see how you do. That's stress inoculation training, Brian. So I would agree with that. But it's all about the cognitive load. Your brain has a certain amount of cognitive load that it can accept. If it gets past that load, it'll shut down and go to the primitive brain, and then it's a crapshoot. Your livelihood at that point is up to God, Buddha, Vishnu, and luck, and your training and experience.
And you know, you both described it similarly. You know, and you know, Brian, you said stress is subjective. Well, yeah, absolutely it is. Meaning, what will completely overwhelm me might be just a normal day for someone else, right? So it is inherently subjective, and what I typically see is, and this isn't bad. Again, it's just a different type of approach than what we're talking about, right? So what I'll see is, okay, I need to de-escalate myself before I can de-escalate you. Okay, well, that's true, right? And there's what else do we have? I can do these breathing exercises to bring down my blood pressure and heart rate. I can have these different type of mental models I want to use. There's a lot of different options out there. And it's all, but the idea is it's still all a reaction to the situation, right? What can I do in this situation? I need to search for a tool or a process or a thing I can use to calm myself down. Okay, well, that's a good mindset, but it goes back to us understanding, why don't we start with, how do we not get overwhelmed? How do we not get up to that level where I need to initiate some sort of process? And to back to my examples of just with my family, you know, my wife and I, we both work full time. We're busy as hell. We're both kind of have stuff where we got to respond to a lot of different events, right? We got the little one, the insurgent that wants to do something. We got the dog. We've got this. So sometimes all that stuff starts to coalesce together, right? And we start to get like, I can feel and sense this situation is escalating, right? This is going on. Okay, this is all going on. I'm busy. My wife's busy. The little one's upset over about something that does not matter to us, but it's the worst thing in the world to her, right?
Right.
And that's the point where I don't have to do a breathing thing or something like that. I go, okay, what can I do now to take something off of someone's plate? Whether that's first, I'll take something off my plate. Well, you know what? I'm going to push that call to tomorrow because I can't deal with it right now. What's up with the little one that I can do right now? What's up with my wife that I can take off her plate? Oh, okay, don't worry about dinner tonight. I'll go pick up something from here. And what I'm doing is, rather than, okay, all right, hey guys, let's talk about this. Let's go. It's like, no, let's start focusing on, or taking things off the plate, so to speak. How do I remove tasks from the situation? How do I say, you know what, I don't need to worry about any of this right now.
Reduce the cognitive load. Yeah,
exactly. And this is what
spot
it
on, Brian.
is reducing that cognitive load versus how can I increase my cognition in stressful environments? Like, well, you can't. Like, the answer is you can't. So how do you remove things from the situation that you don't need to focus on? Now, some of that is done implicitly with constantly practicing a magazine reload or a transition from a primary to secondary weapon. If I get really, really good at that, well, I'm reducing my cognitive load because I don't have to think about it. It just happens. It happens without me even thinking about it. So it allows me more attention in that situation. Does that kind of make sense? And it's just my type of approach of looking at it is, what can we do beforehand so we don't have to respond to this event, so we don't have to implement those?
You're talking about on-duty roll call training, which I also call pre-training, right? Because you have to do the pre-training, so I'm focused on the training when I go into it. So you're also talking about cognitive load. What you're doing in your
what do you
family
mean by pre-training?
So
sorry, I don't want to interrupt your flow.
No, but you're
glossed over
spot
something
on.
big there. Yeah.
Listen, we always talk about pedagogy and hegemony, and then we talk about andragogy, and everybody in the room smiles and harumps and slaps the table, and nobody knows what we're talking about. The reason our training is so gosh damn expensive is because pedagogy is how we treat a kid. You just talked about that right now. Reduce their cognitive load, reduce the things on the table, let them focus on the more important tasks. The handle shouldn't be sticking out from the stove because I'm inquisitive. I might pull on it. The television is on top of the dresser and it might be heavy and I want to get up there and change the channel and I might drop. Do we still lose kids to that every year? Yeah. Do we just have a family drown? How could a kid in now this day and age drown? You get what I'm trying to say? When we all understand the TTPs to stop that from happening, that's pedagogy. We have to understand how to learn like a kid and how to teach like a kid. Then we go to andragogy. How do we learn as adults? And I'm not talking about the gosh damn adult learning theory. Anytime something ends with a theory, folks, throw it in a wastebasket, because if it's a theory, you don't need it. What you need is something that's been vetted, that's been around for a good long time. So andragogy in the true Greek lexicon, Brian, was how adults sat around on the steps and talked through those problems. Your writer asked an andragogy-based question. Yeah. Do you get what I'm saying? I don't know Greek well enough to figure out what the next word is. Because I want to say androgynous, and that's how I dress when I go into Gunnison. Yeah. We don't want to say that. But the idea is we take a pedagogical approach, and the hegemony is to make it yours. That's the on-duty and off-duty roll call, the pre-training before we go out on the road. And so the andragogy fails here. Now, I'll give you an example. My FTO tells me, okay, this is how we search a building. Got it. Then we go out and he says, this is how you keep your gun away from the person on a traffic stop. Got it. Listen, always have that flashlight with you because it's a defensive impact tool, even on day shift. Got it. And then he goes, let's go to lunch. And we go to the Ram's Horn and we leave all our tools in the car. Do you get what I'm trying to say? And we sit in a booth surrounded by people that have guns and knives. Well, that's dichotomous. Your brain doesn't understand that. And when there's not the thread of connection that, hey, we're going to lunch now and your security and personal security and safety and your appearance are just as important. That's holistic training, Brian. So what happens is we keep transmitting training, right? But we don't allow for the person to learn that training, demonstrate it back to us, and you're going, that's the FTO manual. No, it's not really, because what we're doing is we're trying to develop behaviors, not get results by checking in the box saying we've achieved that goal when we haven't really achieved it. You haven't achieved it until you've mastered the skill. So knowledge, skills, attitudes, aptitudes, and abilities are what we're going for. And that goes right back to your cognitive load, cognitive task analysis. I need to attend to these three things in this whole big skill, because they're more important than these 9 skills that aren't. And those 9 skills are going to load me to likely delay my decision or make the wrong decision. Do you get where I was going with that? And Brian Willis, I'd like to get your take on that as well.
And absolutely. And I think, again, we need to figure out is how do we develop these skills, but I think it needs to be an ongoing process, right? So a lot of FTOs, they haven't been taught how to teach, how to coach, how to mentor. I think we need to have FTOs and then we need to have FEOs. So your first 3 or 4 months out of the academy should be with somebody that their job is to teach, to coach, to mentor, to develop me, and then we'll evaluate me down the road. But we evaluate people on day one based on a standard 16 or 18 weeks down the road,
Yep.
Which is problematic. But do we teach FTOs how to ask questions, how to develop those mental skills to get people thinking? So, there's 5 questions that I share that come from David Marquet, a former nuclear sub-commander, and does a lot of work in the leadership field, but they switched a lot of things when he took over command of the USS Santa Fe. But one of the things that they went away from was this briefing process where they would just, whoever was in charge would break out the manual, they would read through and then say, okay, everybody got that, everybody good, and everybody nods their head because nobody wants to be the guy or the gal that says no, and switch to a certification process, which was a series of questions. And it's questions that we can combine with a briefing. It's questions an FTO can ask, a supervisor can ask, but it's questions that are, what is your job? What are you thinking about? What decisions might you make? What are you worried about? And what could go wrong? And so it's simple 5 questions, but now I start to understand, do we know what our job is? Do we know what I'm worried about or what I'm concerned about? And do we understand? Now we get to understand how I understand how you think, how Brian thinks, and now we can figure out how can we enhance our thinking skills. But I think we need to look at this as a long-term process. Teach people fundamental skills, but it needs to be slow dripped. So Brian, you mentioned, so in the new house, you've got a theme of the week, but you didn't block a 40-hour week and try and cram everything into 40 hours, right? Which is what we continue to do. That 40 hours is okay if we do it properly, but it should be accompanied by every day's a training day mindset, and make sure that the training is training that changes behavior instead of just people learning the inappropriate lessons on their own. So I think we need to be more intentional and more deliberate about what we do. And we just let this stuff happen haphazardly and hope for the best. And we need to be more intentional and deliberate and weave this into the culture of the organization. So we have a culture of learning, and we're constantly asking questions and having these conversations. But we need people it needs to be a safe environment for me to ask the question. So because if I ask the question, I get shut down right away. The learning is done.
And one of the things too is you brought up is how we approach training, because we have this kind of approach now where everything is so a typical class, let's say the military or something, where you'll have a PowerPoint period of instruction and the instructor walks in and says, good morning, I'm so-and-so. Today, I'm going to be talking about this. Your enabling learning objectives are, and they start reading the stuff off the slide. Your terminal, and you're like, look, that's meant to design the program. Like, you don't have to brief them on that stuff. They got to show them what they're going to do. And we kind of confuse what's important sometimes on those. So perfect example too, same thing for the military. Like you have to learn to rattle off and recite max effective ranges of different weapon systems and the chamber pressure of this belt fed gas operated machine gun. And you need to know, and I'm not saying that's not important, but it's less important than it is to operate it and understand and conceptualize how to use it. And, there's that part of that training model is because of that. And I'll give you a perfect example. When I sat through a class and they went over, this is detonation cord used for making explosives, and they went what it was made out of, and this, I tuned out. And when they said, hey, this is your firing device, this is non-electrical, this is electrical, this is how you set up, like I tuned it out. But when we're sitting there outside, waiting to draw weapons out of the armory, and chief scout of the platoon comes over and says, all right, I'm going to show you how to use det cord using this 550 cord, this green 550 cord, which looks very similar, right? Doesn't feel the same, but it looks like it. All right, this is how you tie this type of charge. This is why you loop it this way. Now show me how to do that. I was like, oh, okay. So when we did that, well, guess what happens when we end up getting out to the range to actually go use it? I felt like I was an expert already. I'd done it 10 times with 550 cord, so I knew how to do it. And I understood, like, oh, now I see what you mean, because det cord obviously is not as nimble and pliable as paracord, but that took 2 seconds to learn once I picked it up. The other part of the learning how to tie the charges, that was the most important part. Now, did I get the exact standoff distance right? Well, no, but it was close enough for safety reasons. Did I remember how many feet per second that det cord burns at? No, I didn't, but I know how to use it, and I know when to use it appropriately. So we often look at this like, I can recite the facts and the numbers on this. I mean, how many times, Greg, if we worked with like a specialized unit, I'm like, and they're going the specific definition of what type of AK it is versus this, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know. So it's one of those longer guns that like can kill me from farther away, not like the shorter
Not that
ones.
a little close one, yeah.
And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, cool, that's all I need to know. And it's like, well, don't you know? It's like, no, I don't.
Again, for anybody listening, let me take it back to the street, the white belt. What Brian just explained to you in his definition and his story was that a cognitive task analysis will help you reduce your cognitive load, so you only have to attend to those things that are most important in that situation for your survival. That's part one. Second, what I'm hearing Brian Willis say is embrace both formal and informal training opportunities so you can create lifelong learners. And that goes back to what we instilled when we built Combat Hunter, which was every Marine a collector. And when we built ASAT, every soldier a sensor, because every single person out there has to work together to create that seamless flow. And that means the janitor at the police station has to be in the know with the supervisory level, and the dispatcher has to understand the coppers that are on the street, and the cops have to understand their environment and their town manager. Because if you don't, Brian, what's going to happen is every time that you have a peak in a valley, that active killer, okay, what you're going to do is have a cognitive overload. And when you have a cognitive overload, stuff's going to spill out of that cup. It's going to squeeze out of those stress fractures, and you're not going to like the results. Training changes behavior. Now, training is too late in the moment. Is it ever too late to survive? No, that's called resilience and adaptability. We get that. But what I'm trying to tell you is if all you're training for is on the X and plugging holes and making holes, then guess what? You're going in that wrong direction. I feel strongly about that, Brian.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think that, and it's something you guys talked about before when you mentioned tier 1 military units. And I think what we do is we over sensationalize, or that's not the right word, but we see these movies of BUDS training, and people think that that's what builds a Navy SEAL. And what they miss is that BUDS is the first part of a 2.5-year process. That it's 2.5 years of training before you deploy on a mission as a Navy SEAL. When I talked to a 28-year member of the SEAL teams, and part of that was SEAL Team 6, he talked about 6 to 9 month deployments, and then we come back for an 18-month training iteration, then we deploy 6 to 9 months. And I said, so what would it be like for you if you trained almost never and deployed constantly? Because that's the world that we function in. So we need to step back. What you guys have the ability to do is you had the ability, because you created the Combat Hunter combat profiling program, but you have the ability to show people that this is a human skill. It's applicable in any profession, in any domain. Not everybody can do that. People pluck some of this stuff and don't have the ability to make it understandable for people.
Right.
What I get is that what you guys help people to do is you help them to know what they don't know, and you help them to know what they do know but didn't realize that they knew, and then how to apply that. Because that's I think the piece that we're missing is, first of all, we need to help people understand, what we don't know, but then what do you know that, and how do you apply what you do know now, and how do you be more intentional and deliberate about it? So I think we need to continue to build on these things, but make it appropriate for the audience, because what's appropriate for LAPD SWAT is not appropriate for the vast majority of police departments in North America.
Amen.
And so, you know, what's appropriate for the Navy SEALs or Delta Force or Special Forces or Marine Recon is generally not appropriate. There's certainly lessons that we can pull from those people. I think some of the greatest lessons around mindset and the mental preparation piece. And what we want to focus on a lot of time is the shooting, the running, the gunning, instead of picking their brains about how do they think and how do they avoid that cognitive overload in those very kinetic environments. And so I think we need to focus more on what we pull from some of these groups.
Well, and because my opinion on a lot of that stuff is you're already good enough to where you need to be when it comes to those skill sets. I mean, a lot of, you know, police agencies and stuff we've seen, like you're already there. Like you don't need
so
to
we're
be,
not going to spend time on that.
But that's the thing
there.
is like you don't need to be at that. You're not a tier 1 unit that has been qualified to do hostage rescue in some obscure place in the world. That's not what you do. You don't need to be at that level. Like you need to be where you're at. And the thinking portion is everyone goes straight to, okay, well, let's say, give you an example. We're executing the search warrant on this place. I'm like, well, why? Well, we got an arrest warrant for this guy. It's like, yeah, but why are you getting him? Why are you going into his house to get him? Like, well, no, we have to go arrest him. So I want to bring up the situation. I'm like, no, you're not getting it. Like, you're starting way too late in the game. I'm saying, why are you doing that right now? Why is this the time and place you chose to do this? Because the way our legal system works is if you've got it on the guy and you've got an arrest warrant and you've got this, you can go do it. You have freedom to do it in the manner in which you choose, so long as it doesn't, you know, you don't want to, you know, endanger the public, right? But why are you doing it there? Why don't you wait till he goes and, you know, eats at that favorite restaurant once a week and he's driving home all fat and happy and just do a stop on him? And there you go. Because like what do you think is going to happen? You're opening up this world of possibilities. Sometimes our own procedures will do that, to where that will lead to these potentially dangerous situations where we could have just avoided that in the first place. And that gets into that thinking. I mean, I don't know if you've seen something similar, but it's just, that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is why are we doing this right now at this time and place? You can choose, you can take the initiative from the person and you can choose what's going to happen next.
And just because we can doesn't mean we should,
right?
And so it goes back to what you guys talk about with what's the most likely course of action, what's the most dangerous course of action. And again, are we creating these exigent circumstances? Are we forcing somebody else's hand? So, you know, we need to step back with some of these things, but that becomes the key, I think, is to, do we have a culture where it's acceptable to ask questions, to challenge the plan, to challenge the status quo, to ask some of those questions about what's the rush? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this now? Could we not make a phone call? Could we not wait a little while? Could we not get some other resources? Because I think we have situations historically in North America where we have officers that are dead because nobody would ask those questions. A whole bunch of people knew that it was a stupid plan, but the culture was shut your mouth and do what you're told, and nobody would ask the question. So I think we need to change that culture piece to help people understand the importance of creating an environment where it's okay to ask questions. There are times we just need to do, but those are very, very small percentage of the times. So create an environment where, and do that as Greg talked about in the pre-training, pre-event, where we ask the questions and we talk about if this happens, what could we do? What are some of our options? And work through that and be having those conversations on a regular basis so that when it does happen, then we have a better sense. And I think we need to stop confusing the statement people have been trained in with the reality that they simply attended a training block in. So we haven't.
They were exposed to, right? They weren't trained. They were exposed to training. Yes. And they were exposed to a mindset. I would agree with that. And if I might, Brian, that's one reason why. And sorry, folks, bio break. Greg's old. When you take a look at the SEAL training you were talking about, we trained the GRU, and you know what? The Dev group didn't come to us and say, "Hey, we'd like you to reenact the beach portion of our BUDS training." What they said
Yeah.
is, they said is, we're the experts. We don't need you for any of that. We got that. But it's just one laser focused thing that we don't have that we'd like to talk to you about. And I think if people thought of that, it would be great. And to your second point, Brian and I conduct corporate training as well. And when we go into the corporate training, we can tell a broken agency immediately. You know why? Because we come up and we have a thought lesson, a thought provoking question, and it's crickets on the other end. It's silence. And then when it's in person, you know what it is? It's crickets, and they all look at their boss. And
Yeah.
it's like, no, we want to know what you think of this situation. And they dare not go away from whatever they were told that they're, you asked it earlier. What's your role? What's your job? One of the great cop, long dead now, God rest his soul, used to say, Remo, you got a badge, you got a gun, figure it out. What do you do next? And in that moment right there, you knew that this old gosh darn crusty road vet got it. So I say that we have to stop with the certification mill approach as well. Because now, like, LinkedIn's my only social media. So now on LinkedIn, it's so-and-so international, so-and-so national recognition of whatever. And there's 8 different agencies that the person has after his name. It doesn't matter. We've been poked and prodded by real organizations. How about going out and getting your curriculum tested and vetted? You get what I'm saying, by Office of Naval Research or Army Research Institute. And I'm not calling you out, folks, but what I'm saying is what you think passes for training is the result of your confirmation bias, and you've never had peer review. So I love peer review.
Yeah.
Brian, you know why you're on right now? Brian Willis, because we hold you in high esteem and we consider you peer review. And if you told us we were going in the wrong direction, by God, we'd stop and we'd reassess. That's the greatest compliment I think I can give you, Brian.
Well, and I certainly appreciate that. And I really want to build on the one point that you made, is that these groups, which are elite groups in the world,
right,
have the courage and the understanding to bring somebody in that's not part of that organization. Bring you guys in because your area of expertise, and say, this is where we're missing. So I had a conversation yesterday with Jason Bresler, who is currently a lieutenant with the Fire Department in New York. He's a major in the Marine Corps reserves, 4 combat deployments, 2 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, involved in a lot of combat, been a firefighter in New York for a long time. But he was one of the group, and it was a big initiative that started this mental performance initiative with FDNY. And what they did is they realized that we spent a lot of time focused on the technical, tactical, the physical. We don't pay enough attention to the mental side, and let's look at what can we do to enhance performance. So they reached out to a whole bunch of subject matter experts from sports, from academia, from the military, from groups, to put together a program that would enhance the mental skills of firefighters to enhance performance. When we look at some of these things from a law enforcement perspective, our psychologists are all clinical psychologists. That's necessary, but we don't have high performance directors. We don't employ sport and performance psychologists. So we don't employ the Andy Reeses and the Michael Gervais and some of those other people that you guys know to help us figure out, how do we enhance performance? We're just always reactive. And then that's why we do the debriefs on the back end, and we crap all over people. And then, we say, don't do that stupid shit again, or something bad's going to happen. And there's no positive learning that comes out of that. So we need to change this model and look at what can we do to bring in people like yourselves and other subject matter experts in a variety of fields to enhance performance. Let's create high performance directors. Let's look at enhancing performance in our profession and being proactive rather than always being reactive.
Amen.
No, that's it's a lot of, it's like, man, I can't believe we've already been talking for over an hour. A lot of good points that were brought up. And, I always want to try and stay. It's like you're trying to, I love it when someone asks us a question or a series of questions, and then we got to do it depends. Like, we have to talk about all of these things, all of these topics, to get in there and answer it. And it's not, it's not designed to be that way. It's just, well, let's really understand the complexity of what you're asking and where training is at and where training should be. And the problem is, if I do something one way and I then get thrust into a real situation and it worked, that's now it for me. That's how I'm always going to do it. even though it might not be the best way, right? And we all have that comes down, and you have people like, "Well, this is how we do it because so and so died when we did it the other way." And it's like, I know,
Yes.
but right now, think about the progression. I always tell people, and you kind of hit on it earlier. It's like, people, Greg even said it. Your SOPs and TTPs, they're written in blood, which means you're doing it right now. 10 years ago it was done differently, and 20 years before that it was done differently, and 40 years before that it was done differently because someone died and we figured out there's a better way to do that, which means the way you're doing things right now is not the best way. It's the best way of, and approaching it like that is, yes, this is something we're going to do, but I have to be able to challenge my assumptions and how I'm going to do things, because there is a better way out there. I just don't know it yet. And I don't want to learn that the hard way. And that's our biggest thing is these lessons learned aren't always done correctly. And it goes back to well, what kind of weapon system did the person have, and what was the distance between here and there, and can this angle be changed if I rotate a vehicle this way, and then we could armor that side, and then let's use this new tactic. It's like, whoa, what decisions led us to get to this situation? That's what we need to question and understand. That stuff is all important for reporting and court testimony and documentation, but for the lesson learned isn't that Timothy McVeigh used a certain type of racing fuel and then high nitrate fertilizer to make his bomb. That's not the takeaway. That's an easy fix. The takeaway is he pulled his Ryder truck up in front of the L.P. Murrow Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and he parked it there for 10 minutes. Then he got in and drove away. And then he went back and he parked it there for 20 minutes and then drove away. And he did this over a course of time, testing to see what the response was. And there was nothing. Okay. That's the takeaway, right? The takeaway is look at all of these indicators here, meaning I don't care about all the technical stuff. It's how was this process used? What were the steps in there that I could have identified? And all of these cases we talk about, whether it's something officer involved shooting. I mean, people do send us videos all the time like, oh, break this down. It's like, why? It's so easy. Like anyone can look at that and see the mistakes. Let's use this one over here that's a little bit more complicated.
Right.
And right. I think we have this, need to, I want to see the latest thing, and here's what's going on. What did he do wrong? We all bash on that guy for doing it wrong. And I'm sitting here going like, I'm watching that. I'm like, I would have done the same thing in that situation. So would you, because he missed all of these steps leading up to it where he could have intervened at a lower level and chose not to because he didn't know that he could. Right. I mean, that's kind of what we get in the approach we take. So yeah, I kind of want to throw to you guys too for kind of some other comments or final comments. We don't have to...
I would say that's right, Brian. And I would say bringing it in for a landing, I would add this. Brian Willis, Brian and I, and that nobody fast ropes into our training. Nobody fires a shot, boots a door, or rams a car during our training. Yet every after-action review that we get from trainers like yourself and vets and people that have been through combat deployments is, where was this training before I left? Why? Because we challenge them in an area that they have yet to be challenged, and we give them a realistic cognitive way ahead to solve problems, sense make, and get better at the subject matter expertise they already have. So here is my challenge to you. This podcast isn't training. That's not why it's out here. It's to kickstart you to thinking about where to go. Bring in, second part, bring in an expert. May be a little more expensive to bring in and have take a look at your program and help you, but it will pay dividends. Your return on your investment will be huge. Because if not, and I'll give you one quick story, when you're firing to zero to BZO your weapon, you fire 3-round groups. Then you draw the little triangle and figure out where it is and where the bullseye is so you can adjust your sights to get on target. The best bang for your buck for us, for the type of training that Brian Willis provides and what he writes about, his content is amazing, folks. Look him up. Is we want to get you from that 3-round group on target as quickly as possible, because it saves lives on both sides of the badge, and it's frugal, it saves money, and it's smart. It's going to save you in court testimony, Your Honor. If you can understand what I just said, then dial us up or contact us, because that's how you improve the training that you already have. If not, confirmation bias is going to take over, and all your people are going to harumph and slap the table and say, we've got the best training program anywhere, as long as nobody comes in and takes a look at it. You know what I'm saying? or it doesn't withstand legal. And Brian, I'd love to pass it over to Brian Willis, because again, I hold him in such high esteem.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I think a couple of things go back to the initial email that started this conversation is, and you touched on this, Brian, is that what we need to understand is that SOPs are based on the best information that that agency had access to at that time when that past event happened.
Yep.
It doesn't mean that it's still the best information. So that's why we need to keep asking these questions. His question about what should we be doing on the next training day, how about if we reframe that as what could we be doing every day to enhance our ability to think and perform when we get thrust into these situations? And I think when we teach these cognitive skills that you guys have been talking about and that you guys focus on, I think one of the unique challenges to the law enforcement profession is I think that there's a fifth level of competency that nobody else has. So we talk about the unconscious incompetent, conscious incompetent, conscious competent, and unconscious competent. And I think for the law enforcement profession, they need to be an unconscious articulate competent. It's not enough to do what's right. They're going to be thrust into a situation in a court of law or court of inquiry where they have to be able to articulate. If we teach them to think, if we teach them to manage that cognitive load, as you guys have talked about, then not only are they going to perform better and be able to think their way through it, but they're going to be able afterwards to articulate why what they did in that moment in time was reasonable based on the totality of circumstances for them. And that's where we need to be going.
No, and to I'll end on what something actually Greg has referred to as, when you're talking about, the stages of competency. I forget who wrote that, but what we always say is you're in this human behavior stuff that we teach and understanding how to read it. Like you're already an unconscious competent. You actually know how to do this. So we take that and make you a conscious competent of it. Now we give you words to describe the experiences you've already had, the observations you're seeing. And with that lexicon, those words that are scientific and legal and moral and ethical, I can make a more informed decision had I not known that. And that's just based on your life experience. I mean, how many times, Greg, this past course we just did last week, bro, how many times did I bring up like the insurgent at home and training that? Right. And they all went, oh yeah, that's right. Because a lot of them had kids in there too. And the point was, look, that's what you're doing. You know how to do this. You know what this looks like. Hey, look at kids because they're slower at lying than adults are. So you can practice on them. You know what I'm saying? But the idea is there's certain intuitive skill sets that all humans have that Greg and I train people to do and use effectively and efficiently, because that's going to work in any situation. And it's completely it doesn't matter what your TTPs and SOPs are. It doesn't matter what your role is. All that comes after the fact of what we do, and it's important and it's likely good. So why are we still having these issues? I'm sitting here telling people like, no, your SOPs and stuff are probably good. It's like, well, why are we still having problems? Like, exactly. That's what we're talking about. We're always going to have a better weapon system or a better shield or a better operational framework to go, how do we interact with other agencies? Let's set up this task force to learn how to communicate across these different domains. And we get really, really good at that. Why are we still having issues then? Because it's just the human, it's the person. That's what we need to focus on. And that's
the human in the loop.
Exactly. And so,
Brian, I'll ask you this question. You know what the difference between information and intelligence is? You are.
Yeah.
And if you don't get that, you know what the difference between a tool and a weapon is? Intent. If you don't get that, right, those are the master class elements that you should have in your training every day.
Well, I appreciate first of all, thanks to the listener who reached out with questions. He always gets more than he kind of asked for, I guess. So that's what you get for asking us those questions. But I appreciate it, brother. Thank you for doing that, and thank you, Brian, for coming on. Like I said, I'm gonna have everyone listening. I'll have the links to all Brian's stuff in the episode details. I know you listened to an intro to him at the beginning, but he's an incredible, like the term thought leader, it gets thrown around. Brian actually is a thought leader.
Right.
He's the one asking these questions and having these great discussions about it from just a ton of experience. So I do very much appreciate you coming on the show, Brian. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. And I really, really appreciate all of the support that the two of you have given me, because I hold the two of you in high regard. And so it means a lot to me.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Greg. And everyone listening, don't forget that training changes behavior.